I want to show you something about the scope called the coupling, or AC and DC coupling. And if you recall, in another video that I have, I showed the DC offset button. And so when we select DC offset, and I'll keep the camera right about there, I can change the DC offset. And here's something interesting from another video, is we talked about the trigger. I just put the DC value so low that we no longer are triggering, so I'd have to change my trigger level on my scope. So I'm changing that on the scope so it no longer scrolls. And you notice, just as expected, we have a DC slope, or a DC offset to our waveform that I can move up and down without a problem. Alright, one of the settings here on the scope, and I'm just going to move us over, if I hit the menu for this, is the first thing is coupling. Well, that's kind of interesting. You may not have ever clicked on that, but there's DC, AC, and ground. Ground is kind of boring. Right now, we've probably always been DC coupled, but maybe one time you came in and the scope was kind of set funny, and you got AC coupled. Well, someone came over here on the DC offset, and they started changing it, and you said, that's kind of funny. They're changing the DC offset, but it looks like it's staying the same. What the AC coupling is doing is it's taking the average of the waveform and subtracting it off. And so it's essentially removing the DC offset. It's only concerned about the AC signal. This can be very useful if we have a small AC signal on top of a very large DC signal, so we can actually look at the waveform without having to scroll and scan and do all those kind of things. We just have to turn on AC coupling. And so we can see that there is a DC offset, so I have a DC offset on there now, but not until I switch it back to DC coupling, we can see that it's way up there. I got to switch up my trigger value. It's way up there, and my knob here will bring it down. So if your signal is not doing what it's supposed to, you may want to check the coupling of your channel 1 and channel 2. By the way, channel 1 and channel 2 can be coupled differently. This one can be AC coupled, and this one can be DC coupled. And so it's something to check if you aren't getting the signal that you want, or you're trying to add a DC signal and it doesn't come there, or if you have an AC signal on top of a DC signal, you just want to see the AC signal.